Hello. On Society Blends episode 21, I will continue the presentation that focused previously on manga and move it to the next level and think about anime and Western cartoons. And we will be thinking about cartoon series and anime series to have a rough understanding of what actually changed a lot in America and Europe. I hope you'll like the presentation and there are many aspects that probably I left behind. However, I hope you will enjoy it. So without further ado, let's think a bit about where this whole adventure started. And I think the most important element in this case is the fact that America had a major role in starting cultural phenomenon. And this was due to a number of factors, of course. One of the most important ones being that America had vast resources and it invested in a cultural project that was actually highly successful. And the beginning of it, or the start of it, can be thought about with the Hollywood setting that was really a very good place where creation and imagination ideas could find a very good way of working together. And the most prominent place I would think of is Metro Goldwyn Mayer. Metro Goldwyn Mayer was a major production studio that featured a lot of movies in the early 1930s, and it grew to be extremely successful. Well, over there, highly successful animated cartoon, Tom and Jerry, which you probably may know of, or if you don't, there is a lot that can be said about it, was born. And it mattered because it created us an animated series that later grew on to be very popular and picked up on the public's interest. While Walt Disney can also be considered a major prominent creator, I think that at least for what we are focusing upon right now, the moment of Tom and Jerry and the creation of such a series was essential. Of course, we don't have to think in a vacuum or in a void the Tom and Jerry success. There were also other studios such as Warner Bros. That started to create a cartoon series. However, what mattered much more than that is the fact that at this studio, two highly successful and talented co-workers, Dan Bihana and Joseph Barbera, started to work on their own animation studio, Hanna-Barbera. And this studio has created many series that we were very fond of in the past, and of course, that were highly influential to modern cartoons, as well as for the cultural phenomenon itself. For instance, we can think about Flintstones, Yogi Bear, Top Cat, The Jetsons, Scooby-Doo, and there are actually many more titles, but these are the ones that are mostly remembered when we think about Hanna-Barbera. Of course, in the past there was a very major transition from traditional theaters or cinemas to television, and this meant that the popularity of cartoon series morphed and changed in quite serious ways. And while initially a new and entirely surprising public was found, later on this public changed its preferences and of course was mm, in a way exposed to much more creations than just the American ones. And this way of evolution is actually what brought us at the current time where there is a serious debate about anime and Western style cartoons. So let's think of more about what actually changed in the early days, or at least in during the moment when American cartoons were highly popular. Well, we have to think about how the format transformed when television took place. And this happened quite early on. We can think about the late 60s as early 70s, already bringing such changes quite quickly. Because the major broadcasters had to expand their network. There were also issues with the access to technology, and of course later on an economy that was slightly slowing down due to the oil crisis, which meant that there were more challenges, and of course the golden times of Western style cartoons was really put under a lot of pressure. And this meant that many cartoon studios, including Hanna-Barbera, had to resort to sequels and spin-offs in an attempt to retain the fan base and just as well dramatically lower production costs and risks, because it was a matter of surviving rather than expanding your fan base. And they got to understand this transition quite quickly. And as the 1980s rolled on, there was another important factor that was added to the mix. The fact that, of course, there were family uh, TV productions that were also released in series, and they grew to be very successful. This created an increased pressure on Western style cartoons, and the way in which they were released, the format that was somewhat stable actually played against the format of such cartoons. And I think this is important because cartoons were still thought of as being creations oriented mainly as at children and at their enjoyment. So the family TV series had a bit more detail that could be shown on, and perhaps they were more appealing than cartoons. And it can also be said the fact that since Hanna-Barbera was supplying so many of the early cartoons and influenced so much the style, there was, in a sense, an attempt to free yourself from a trend that was already feeling quite constraining. And this meant that TV series grew in popularity while cartoons were relegated more and more to smaller and smaller stations, still um, attracting the public but not being in the front stage. And this is actually a very important phenomenon because during the same time we will see that anime took a good hold, and this is what actually meant that the public got to have a different perspective quite early on. Well, the most important anime series that was presented in America, and as you will see quite clearly, is Astro Boy in 1963. Since it was the beginning of Western exposure to Eastern cultural creations, it didn't create such a large impact. However, it was the start of a major trend, and in less than 20 years, it was already obvious that the Western style cartoon was changing in an attempt to keep pace and innovate where it was felt that the public was changing their own preferences and they were maybe asking for a different product. So Saber Rider and Star Sheriffs, released in 1987, I think it's a landmark example or a highlight of a mixed anime and Western style cartoon perspective. And it was not the first, I think it was probably the most prominent example. Later on, it was followed by many other cartoons that had a different perspective that was neither the traditional Western or American style, neither the anime style. So actually, this meant that the way in which we later see the evolution of anime and the exposure has been relatively consistent but also mixed in a sense, meaning that the borders, the limits of artistic creations have been blurred more and more. However, the anime style remained relatively consistent, which is probably one of the reasons why it grew in popularity, not considering, of course, the vast array of subjects or demographics to which it could cater. So, uh, as someone was growing up, they found out more and more creations that could cater to their style. But however, this is not the main factor. The most important one was that more and more anime series were presented in America and Europe, and of course, the mid 90s, I think it was a highly proficient time because most of the cartoons that are fondly remembered have been established then and created a strong fan base. So, for instance, Sailor Moon was a very large phenomenon between 1992 and 1995, and it had reverberations up, I think, close to the new millennium in around 2000, 2001. Dragon Ball, Galaxy Rangers, of course, are other notable examples. However, we don't have to think that the Western style cartoon died. Far from that. It changed a lot. However, most of the creations were already in a situation to be quickly compared to anime ones because the market was actually evolving and expanding so much that Western or American cartoons were not as prominent anymore. And even if we count the European creations, for instance, the French were still having successful cartoons such as Pif et Hercule, and just as well the Canadians had the success with the raccoons. The competition was much stronger, and it meant that the way in which American or Western style cartoons was considered was a bit stricter than in the past because, as I said, the audience grew. It had a different style, it had different expectations and wanted more sophistication, which obviously both the anime and Western style cartoons were trying to cater to. Of course, the American style cartoon had some success and quite a major one if we think that there are still manifestations of fans, for instance, of series such as Captain Planet or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which of course were titles that had the biggest impact in the first half of the 1990s. The Japanese ones can also be remembered with Pokemon and Naruto, and particularly as the creation of such anime was quickly followed or was predated by manga, it meant that there were already at least two major product lines that were complementing each other. By contrast, in America, there was less focus on a comic strip that could accompany a cartoon series, or if there was such a situation, they didn't maintain that process long enough to establish, nurture, and motivate an audience. So they much more quickly faded out. By comparison, the Japanese creations had much more impact, and particularly for the American and the European audiences, and meant that a stronger fan base was established, and they also created various items that could make them much more aware of the progress and of course of their love for the characters and the story, which meant that Western style cartoons were already losing this competition, which is not necessarily a bad thing because as the Western style cartoons were under some pressure, also some very good creations were released, which meant that there was a balance that was kept. And we have to think again, the Western style cartoon also has the competition of a huge amount of movies, most of them being released in America and some also coming from the European continent, with major creations also coming from other areas such as the Latin America or Asia, of course, which means that the Western style influence is never probably diminished, but the Western style cartoon as a central element of it clearly is not in the focus anymore. It hasn't been in the past as well, but its role today is much more reduced. On the other side, with Japanese creations, the anime and manga products are probably the most important exposure to the Asian culture, which means that there are various details that should be considered when having this sort of debate. All right, let's move on. So, why the Japanese influence matters? Actually, I covered a bit this subject before when thinking about the way in which the artistic style of Western cartoons was modified. And of course, you have the very nice picture on the left that I think gives you a quite good understanding of what changed. If you remember closely from the previous episode that covered the traditional comic strip, facial features were much more subdued. On the other hand, in anime and manga, they are much more emphasized. And as you can see, probably there is the higher impact of eyes and other elements that are amplified, other facial features that are amplified or subdued compared with the typical Western comic strip or Western style cartoon. And this is a major influence that actually made the Western style cartoon much more attractive, while still not setting aside all the elements that have been so successful and so attractive to the audience. And as you can readily see, I think the result can be quite good. It can be considered for its artistic merit in various ways. Of course, it's much more difficult to assess. However, I think it's important because it shows a very good example of how an influence can blend so much in the end product and blend so well in a way that is attractive to the audience, and just as well one that is very good at making a story compelling. But why this method a lot? Why this change? Well, we have to understand the fact that distribution, of course, in America for anime was getting much more difficult in the 1980s, and the 1990s have actually shown more challenges for American broadcasters because they were looking at cutting costs, and this meant that the traditional mm, style of shows they could present on their programs had to follow different budgets. And of course, this meant you either had to resort to reruns or you had to resort to lower quality productions. And many, of course, chose to go the other route, and this meant import from Japan, Hong Kong, and other countries. And it's one of the many reasons we have seen probably so many kung fu movies from the second half of the 80s up to the beginning of the 90s, for instance. In this context, of course, American as well as French cartoons were having less presence, and of course, there were less productions that were um, available on the market. And this meant that there was also a major opportunity for Japanese ones, especially when we have to consider that Japanese productions were initially released at such low prices that they offered a compelling alternative. So what happened in the 90s is also due to the economic situation of many broadcasters that forced them to try to find attractive productions that were also um, available at very low cost. And in the end, this created a very interesting situation because When we think about the impact that anime had, we don't have to focus only on the public. We also have to think about the larger impact on creators as well, and the way in which creators and the audience will move further in their preferences. And I think this matters a lot because different interpretations, different experimentations can be made in this circumstance. And this is why the Japanese influence was in no way a threat to the Western one. It was an all-encompassing new experience, a new approach that actually showed a lot of prospect and inspired so many ideas that were later quite fruitful. We have to think a lot about also what it meant when so much present and so much of what we see today is actually due to what happened in the 80s and 90s. It seems to be perhaps a time that is so far away from today. However, it mattered a lot because the teenagers that were exposed to such creations at that time grew into a highly loyal fan base. And most of them inspired and created later a trend that had a large impact on the current and the close to recent teenage generation. And this matters a lot because having such guidance and having so many products that could inspire you is actually going to have a lasting influence. So we don't have to take this way in which anime grew as something that came out of nowhere. Far from that. It was a long development of a social trend, and it amplified the more it captured individuals, and particularly highly passionate ones, because their creativity and ambition grew to such high amplitudes that it was able to attract others to follow the same path. And we don't have to think that it was only for the entertainment purpose, because if we consider just about any cultural creation, not only cartoons or anime, but just about any cultural creation only due to its entertainment value, we are going to lose a lot of what matters. The fact that it's, first of all, an educational foray. It may seem sometimes too mundane, too simple to even acknowledge, but it matters a lot because showing a vast array of possibilities, whether we are talking about movies or we are talking about anime and cartoons, helps individuals make a choice, help them be exposed to a different artistic taste, makes them develop their self, their personality, and it shapes the way in which they work and spend leisure time. And this matters a lot because many individuals found a very good um, refuge in anime, and the way in which the society was portrayed created a sort of feeling of belonging, which matters a lot, particularly when you seem to be having so little impact on what happens around. So having a place where you could find comfort matters a lot. And of course, there were so many subjects or tropes that were placed with a lot of imagination, not only in anime, but also in cartoons, so that individuals really felt that having a particular perspective or being more playful in their attitude would not be frowned upon by the society. And this creates or reduces the level of discomfort and matters a lot when, of course, we can think about the transition from teenagers to adulthood or maturity for them. And having this vast array of choices presented to them actually makes them form an identity and be at least somewhat satisfied with the current state of things if they are not overly ecstatic about some of the prospects they may face. I think it has a very important role in society, the fact that we are exposed to these different creations and that we develop a following, because we have to think about another example that we, at least in the Western world, are not particularly knowledgeable of. Since we mostly live in a society that has a high degree of freedom, we may have forgotten that, at least in parts of Europe and not only there was a time where there was less choice. There was less of a chance to express yourself as you would like. And this type of creations actually showed, along with, of course, the Western ones, a degree of freedom that you could aspire to. And this matters a lot because there are many areas around the world where such creations, and particularly anime, are felt as less of a threat than an outright Western influence. And since creations can be selectively seen, it means that a particular message may be received by the audience. And this is why it also matters, because anime is created in a country that has a good degree of freedom. Of course, it has its own set of problems. Japan is not perfect, but neither is Europe nor America. You can find in just about any country, in every area, a situation that doesn't work. But however, there is a lot of freedom, and this freedom could be aspired to. And this matters because it's a non-unifying message. It's one that is neither for a particular country at all. And the Japanese, being exposed to cultural manifestations from all around the world, developed a sense of binding such elements. And it doesn't matter if they are bound in more or less realistic ways. The fact that they are bound somehow means that you are not left behind when you are coming from a different culture. So there are elements that seem familiar to you, while others are totally out of discussion. And this matters because in order for a cultural product to have success, it has to have also a degree of accessibility. And the level of accessibility and the fact that the message could be more or less translated quite easily, even if the language may still be a barrier, it's actually one of the elements that is the most um, the most easy to overcome, because actually translations can be made in just about any language. It means that it creates an unifying message, and it unifies, of course, the audience all around the world, which is important, but in hindsight is not necessarily spectacular. This is what good cultural creations can do. But it's one of the major reasons why other cultural creations that, for instance, cater to more political whims are not having this sort of attraction. And anime is one of the major voices in the world for freedom. It doesn't matter if the subject is utopical or dystopical. It doesn't matter. It matters that it's there and you have the choice of seeing it unconstrained, and you have a lot to choose from. We are getting close to one of the most important parts, and the one of morphing preferences. Why I decided to name it as such? Because in the past, the Western style cartoon was prominent. From a point further, a choice appeared in anime. And as we were exposed more and more to anime, we grew into a sense highly different from the point where we started. And even if we think that for the Americans, it's more of a debate between the Western and the Eastern style, I think that for Europeans, it's slightly more clear in the sense that the Japanese anime has a presence, has a strong following. It's going to be considered a major element in the way in which we portray global culture. And this means that the way in which we communicate and the way in which the public manifests is highly different. And it matters a lot because today's world presents also the high availability of streaming platforms. So you don't have to rent video cassettes. You don't have to use CDs or DVDs. You don't have to have all sorts of ways, of difficult ways through which you can access your favorite cultural product. They are available streaming, meaning that you pay for a service, and this service can, at the click of a button, offer you a vast array of anime series. And this matters a lot because it offers choice. It offers an easy one, and if you hear about something by chance, you can readily see it, which was, of course, not the case some years ago. And highly popular platforms such as Netflix or Hulu, even if they cater to just about any creation, not necessarily anime, but you have it available. You also can go to dedicated ones such as Crunchyroll, Tubi, Retro Creation, High Dive. And this level of accessibility matters a lot because attracting um, a new audience or making the audience follow a trend with high satisfaction is also due to accessibility. And we don't have to see those things as operating in a void either, because access is not only limited to such products that you see on your screen, but there are many others that could be considered essential, such as merchandise that could be found at shops just about any time of the year, or conventions. And conventions in particular incite the public. They offer a very flashy manifestation that draws so much attention and really creates a sense of belonging and purpose to many individuals. And these elements are only present for less than 20 years in most situations, or at least to have a visible presence less than 20 years. I think that all of these details, all of these elements combined create a very good perspective for anime and for the development and appreciation of this style. And in the light of these considerations, I also think that the drawing you see on the left is very good and portrays very well the message. It's highly attractive, it's flashy, and I think it can inspire a lot either a dedicated creator or a viewer to appreciate this style. So I really think that we don't have to be constrained to a single perspective and see the presence of anime as the chance of being exposed to a different culture in a very pleasant way, in one that offers us a choice if we want to pretend or not to live in a different world. And as we are smart, intelligent individuals, I think it matters a lot to have these sort of mind games to play. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, thank you very much. I intend to make more videos with a different subject, but also I will focus on this one that is very interesting and very important. In time, if you want to have a perspective, I think that those videos are going to be more prominent rather than the ones pertaining to all the technology, because I think there are so many interesting elements that we see around us changing, and we want to think in a way about them rather than only taking what was good and bad from the past. But as I said, it's going to be quite difficult to say which kind of video is going to be next. So I hope you enjoyed the ride. And if you do, then thank you very much for watching, and particularly for watching these videos that may be catering to a different audience than the one that was traditionally on the channel. And I thank you very much because I really want to present such subjects.